I'm pleased to present today's webinar. We Speak Translate. What does a Google app have to do with immigrant settlement? More and more forward-looking agencies are looking at how they can use technology to drive innovation in resettlement and integration. But building digital capacity in human service NGOs can be challenging. How can immigrant service organizations harness smart technology to achieve deeper impact? How do you leverage the power of corporate partnerships? Can a Google app become both an integration tool and a symbol of open, inclusive communities? Well, to help us unpack these questions, today's webinar presents a great new idea that's about to go global. The We Speak Translate project is a unique collaboration between Google Translate and the Intercultural Association of Greater Victoria on Canada's west coast that unlocks the potential of the Google Translate app for refugee resettlement and newcomer inclusion in local communities. We are joined today by innovators in the sector. I am delighted to welcome today's guests. Joining us from the west coast of Canada, we have Kate Longpre, who is the Community Integration Coordinator at the Intercultural Association of Greater Victoria. And all the way from Brisbane, Australia, we are joined by Aleem Ali, National Manager of the Welcoming Cities Initiative. Now please let me introduce our guest speaker. Kate Longpre is the Community Integration Coordinator at ICA. She works strategically across sectors to ensure that resettled refugees entering the Greater Victoria area are successfully integrated into welcoming communities. Kate approached Google Translate in September 2016 with the idea for the We Speak Translate project. And in April 2017, the project launched in Victoria, BC, the first location worldwide to initiate the project. Since the launch, Kate has provided We Speak Translate training to a wide variety of community groups, organizations, and even businesses. Some 500 community stakeholders have now received the training, and interest in the project is continuing to expand across Canada and beyond. Kate has spent time living and working in Ecuador and in the Caribbean before relocating to Victoria. And her work in Victoria includes positions with the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Victoria, with the Fairfield Gonzalez Community Center, the James Bay Community Center, and the Victoria West Community Center. Kate holds a Master's in Community Development from the School of Public Administration at the University of Victoria. And we are delighted to have this accomplished and innovator with us today. Welcome, Kate. The podium is yours.
Thank you very much, Kim. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm really looking forward to taking you through a brief presentation about the We Speak Translate project. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the Intercultural Association of Greater Victoria. We're a service provider organization, and we provide settlement service to new immigrants and refugees. We support government-assisted refugees as well as privately sponsored refugees. Our organization, upon arrival of new immigrants and resettled refugees, provides language instruction as well as employment programs, youth programs, daycare, and we also work quite closely with community stakeholders to engage them in diversity training. In terms of immigration and refugee statistics in Victoria, BC, 18% of residents are immigrants, and we had a rather large influx of refugees, refugee resettlement in early 2015. It became a large priority for our organization. Since that time, 462 resettled refugees have arrived in Victoria. 263 of them were government assisted and 199 were privately sponsored. Refugee resettlement in Victoria continues to occur, but at a slower, more gradual rate for now. So I'm going to speak very briefly about my role as the Community Integration Coordinator. My position was funded by the United Way of Greater Victoria, and as Kim said, I work with refugees themselves, service providers, community stakeholders, institutions, as well as the systems that serve them to improve refugee integration into the community. When I started at ICA, I was interested in wanted to sort of delve deeper into what are the challenges for refugees resettling, and language is the #1 barrier to integration. As well, I was interested in looking at, well, how are we using technology, which we use to solve so many, issues and challenges that we face globally? How are we using technology as a resettlement tool? Based on this research, I came up with the idea for the Google Translate and the We Speak Translate project. And the nice thing about this, just sort of before we move on, is that many refugees already had access to smartphones in terms of the technology that they had access to. And most were already familiar using Google Translate because they've used it throughout their transition to Canada and upon their immediate arrival. So it was key we were building on skills and strengths that the resettled refugees already had. So in early October, I came up with the idea that if we could somehow use the Google Translate app and train community stakeholders, community members on how to use the Google Translate app, essentially producing power users, that our community could become more welcoming to a lot of the resettled refugees. I reached out to Google, and many people have asked, well, how did I do that? I literally looked up online, how do you contact Google if you have an idea, and I made contact. Very early on, Google was very responsive. They were very interested in the project. And the project was essentially going to repurpose the Google Translate app, which had already existed. Google Translate had done a similar project at the Rio Olympics, where they had gone down and they had trained, waiters and taxi drivers on how to use the Google Translate app so they could serve visitors who were visiting the Rio Olympics. But I don't think Google Translate had considered using the app as an integration tool in resettlement countries. And so we worked over several months with Google Translate, and I had a couple key contacts there, everything from designing the decals to developing a training deck. And then the project launched in April 2017, and we had one of two of the Google Translate interaction designers attend that launch of the project. So, people often ask, well, how was it working with Google? And as I said, Google Translate was very responsive to the idea, but in terms of bringing the project to fruition, it required a lot of persistence on my part in terms of just following through, keeping that ball rolling, keeping the conversation going. And a lot of times, my contact there sort of said, keep persisting, keep following through with us. But I think what appealed to Google Translate about the project is that their app would now have a broader social impact that they hadn't otherwise explored. And the app would become a tool and a symbol for, that we value diversity, inclusion, and we're going to work with newcomers across their language barriers while their language skills are developing. So essentially what the project is I go out into the community and I provide a 45-minute free training to community stakeholders. Upon completion of that training, they learn all about how the Google Translate app works, all the functions and features, so that when a newcomer comes to their business, organization, grocery store, bank, they feel comfortable pulling out their smartphone and providing an opportunity to communicate with newcomers. Upon completion of the training, these organizations receive a decal, and these decals say "We Speak Translate" or "I Speak Translate." And again, this is a visual symbol that these organizations want to build relationships with new immigrants and refugees. And familiarity with the Google Translate app in terms of being a host community provides a common platform for communication while newcomers develop their English language skills. Again, understanding that a lot of the newcomers that are coming already have familiarity with the Google Translate app. So key, and this is one of sort of the largest learning goals, is I thought that, you know, anyone who heard what Google Translate, you know, is partnering with an organization in Victoria, I thought people would be knocking down my door saying, we need this training right away. But I very early had to realize that it's going to take some time for, you know, the project credibility to build, for traction to build, and of course there was going to be early adopters. But it was very key that I had to go out and identify key stakeholders. Who could I reach out to provide training? Who would be the first organizations and businesses to commit to the project, to participating in the project, and getting those decals up around the community? To date, over 550 organizations have been trained, and that includes libraries, museums, recreation centers, service providers, banks. But again, very key is finding who are going to be those key champions in the community to move the project forward and essentially the symbol forward, because without enough uptake in the project, the symbol won't become a symbol. It's when we start to see around our community and newcomers start to see around our community these decals, and they start to say, well, what is this a symbol of? That again, we start to spread the value of diversity, the value of multiculturalism, and sort of, you know, visibly demonstrate our commitment to those values. Most exciting that has happened actually just last week was the City of Victoria passed a motion to endorse the We Speak Translate project. So all City of Victoria staff who engage directly with you know, the public will receive this training. And I've seen even from the city coming on board, again, there's been another sort of, you know, a bursting, a scaling up again, and we're really seeing that coming to fruition. You know, we're looking at into getting into schools. All of our municipal libraries are now receiving training. I think is also really key is communicating to potential participants in the project, community stakeholders, institution, is sort of the goals of participating in the training, and you can see those there: encouraging, welcoming communities, becoming familiar with an app that already exists. It's free, and people use this not just, you know, they know of this app from a lot of times where they've traveled, they've used this app, but to consider using it in their home community, I think excites people, and it's an idea that people sort of say, oh, I hadn't thought of that. But as I say, scaling up is really key, and we continue to do that. You know, thinking again in our city, you know, we have quite a thriving tourism sector. So again, sort of communicating to sectors even outside of those that typically work with resettled refugees or immigrants. Let's think about how we can support our tourism sector utilizing this project. So now I'm going to go into a little bit about, a little bit more specific about the app. And some of these slides are taken directly from the training that I provide. So Google Translate uses machine translation to translate over 100 languages. And, what I always tell people is the translation and machine translation, it's not always perfect, but it provides a moment of connection that we might not have been able to have. And I often tell a funny story that I was speaking with a woman, she was Arabic speaking and a resettled refugee from Syria, and I was trying to explain that she had received a donation. And I was trying to explain this using Google Translate. And I could tell that the communication, she wasn't understanding my meaning. And finally, somebody came in who did speak Arabic, and I said, can you help me translate? She's not understanding what I'm saying. They had a brief conversation, and he said, well, she keeps wondering why you're asking her if she wants narcotics. Now, this is sort of a funny, a funny and probably worst case scenario of the translation. But I say, there's going to be moments of humor. There's going to be maybe moments of frustration, but hopefully in the end there's moments of understanding. And her and I will never forget that moment. And now this joke that we have together, and we're forever connected because of that moment. So these are different ways that you can access Google Translate. We spend most of the time in terms of the training focusing on the mobile app. Now within the mobile app, there's different features. You can type, write, talk, see, and translate offline. So I go into a little bit more depth in all these training sessions, but there's text-to-translation, and this is available in all languages. And essentially, you're typing in whatever you'd like to have translated, and that is translated, which can be then, played over a speaker in a recording. It can be made into a sign. There's options to share it in emails and Messenger. The next feature is the handwritten character recognition. Now this is available in 93 languages, and this is ideal if you're working with populations that communicate in a language that has characters or characters that are not traditionally found on a keyboard. So if I'm communicating with, for example, a new immigrant from China, they can actually write in characters using their finger on a little notepad, and that can be translated. The next feature is the simultaneous translator on your phone, and this is sort of the conversation mode. And while I think this is probably the most useful feature in the app, it's also probably the one that will be a focus for continued development. And I heard that, from interaction designers that, they're always working on improving the translations and improving, the usability of the app. But essentially, you can select your microphone within the app and record, language, which is then played in a translation, and you can have a conversation going back and forth. The next feature, which is probably, at least in the trainings that I do, the one that sort of gets the most oohs and ahs, and this is the instant translation with your camera lens. Now at present it's available in 29 languages, but essentially you can hold your camera, you give Google Translate access to the camera, and you can hold your camera lens up to a sign, and it will translate virtually in your screen, which is fantastic for short signs, but as well, they've taken it a step further. And let's say you have a document or a brochure, you can actually take a picture of that document. The app scans the document and then produces a translation. Now, again, keeping in mind that the translations might not always be perfect, but if you're looking to get some information to a new immigrant or a refugee in a timely manner, this is an option that I think is really, really useful. And I think finally, what I'll talk about is just that most of these features, and you can access 52 languages offline. So that just requires downloading the app, the languages, so you have access to translations while you're offline, not connected to Wi-Fi and data. And we look at that as very helpful for people like public health nurses who are doing home visits to maternal patients, that they can then very quickly still access Google Translate and translations while they're not connected to Wi-Fi. So we've seen, here's just a little bit, a few quotes from a resettled refugee as well. The goal of the project is that, as new immigrants and resettled refugees navigate their way through our city or other cities, when they see the We Speak Translate decals and windows, or someone pulls out their phone and says we Speak Translate, that they'll feel confident, especially in their initial integration phase, that people want to communicate with them, and community members are going to use the same technology that they're already familiar with to bridge some of these conversations. And at the end of the day, in terms of organizations, the better we are able to serve and connect with new immigrants, we're going to see improved integration. And, integration of newcomers, be them refugees or new immigrants, is key to healthy and connected communities. So, project successes. Again, to date, the project launched in April, and we're very close to having trained 600 community stakeholders, and I'm sure by the end of September we're going to be close to 800, because again, I've it's sort of come in waves, and like I said, I thought that I'd everyone be knocking on my door, but it's taken a lot of persistence to sort of continue to reach out to those key institutions, the education sector, the health sector, to make sure that they really see the value, and I see that really starting to change now, and that the credibility of the project and the scale of the project is starting to expand more quickly. As well, sort of continuing to identify key stakeholders and targeting those key stakeholders. Media for the project, we've been very fortunate again with persistence to continue to get great media coverage of the project. And rather than bore you with all of that, there are links provided to the Intercultural Association website, and specifically we have a page dedicated to the We Speak Translate page. Now, interesting to note, once the project actually kind of got launched, Google was very connected, very involved, leading right up to the launch and the launch event. But upon the launch, when I communicated with my contacts, they sort of said, well, we're not sure we have anybody right now for continued engagement. And I sort of said in response, well, do I have your permission to continue, moving this project and scaling it up and expanding it, however I can do that? And they said, yes, you go right ahead and do that. And it's a pilot project. And I said, wonderful, I will do that. And then I'm going to come back to you and let you know, how many people have been interested, how many people have been trained. And my hope is that, in the next, 3 or 4 months, to be able to go back to Google Translate. And meanwhile, I'm in contact with them, and I'm always updating them with, sort of the next sort of big thing that's happened in the project. But my hope is that, in 3, 4, 6 months, Google Translate themselves is going to have a dedicated person for this project, and they're going to see the benefit and the demand that communities and countries have to have a tool and a symbol that can work for resettling and welcoming newcomers. That it'll be hard to say no, and it will become a really important project under Google Translate. So, the sort of learning takeaways or what I would encourage for organizations who are working in resettlement and integration is, continue to explore resettlement, integration, addressing, racism and prejudice through new lenses. And I think, something that ICA, the Intercultural Association of Greater Victoria, did was they encouraged, their employees to explore creative solutions, and they provided time for that research and sort of that creative process and for ideas to generate. And so I think that's really key, is allowing ourselves the time to look at and explore, how do we address some of the challenges and to think outside the box. I think as well, looking at symbols versus tools, I think the symbol in this project of, value of diversity in our communities, inclusion, multiculturalism, I think that's as important as the app or the tool and the effectiveness of the app and that kind of thing. I think what was really successful in this project as well is we were building on existing infrastructure. We were repurposing an app that already existed, and we were building on skills that a lot of refugees and new immigrants already had. So it actually put some of the onus on the host community or the resettlement communities, and in our case, in our community, and probably in a lot of places in Canada and around the world, communities, institutions, and stakeholders are looking for a way to engage and demonstrate that they are allies to refugees, to internationally displaced persons, and so people are looking for tangible, ways that they can get involved, and I think that was really key as well. And don't assume that your great idea, regardless of who you partner with in the world, is going to take off immediately. There are so many competing social justice issues, global challenges that we have to sort of really champion and believe in these projects and move them forward through our own sort of persistence as well, and find those champions. So before I finish off, the next steps that I see is, for at least for this project, is I imagine we're going to be moving to more of a webinar format to be able to expand the training, and that's great because it can, we're using technology to address resettlement and integration challenges, and we can use technology to continue this training and expand this training. So I see us moving to doing more webinars, and for any organizations or anyone who is part of this webinar, please visit our website, follow us on Instagram, and if you're interested in taking part in the full training, which again is 45 minutes, but doing that in an electronic format, we're interested in looking at those types of opportunities. So thank you very much. That sort of concludes my portion of my presentation. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Kate. That was just wonderful. Thank you for showing us that we all have a new role to play as integration actors, as power users and champions of this great new idea. Your vision for helping communities think differently is wonderful. It really flips the onus of language learning away from the immigrant and onto the host or receiving community, and I think that's a very interesting idea all by itself. So not only is it breaking down communication barriers, it really is sending a message of welcoming. It's also a great example that big ideas can be very simple, low cost, low effort, and these smaller projects can have a huge impact when it comes to helping newcomers feel more welcome. So wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. And I'm sure this is Google Translate is a project that will become an indispensable tool, and it certainly is ready for replication, perhaps to Australia. So let's travel now from Canada to Australia. It's time to turn the conversation over to our second guest, and who today I'd like to welcome. Our guest interviewer is Aleem Ali, founder and national manager of the new Australian initiative Welcoming Cities. Welcoming Cities works with local governments in Australia to develop evidence-based strategies that increase participation and a sense of belonging among all Australians, both in communities and on a national scale. In 2017, Welcoming Cities launched the Australian Standard for Welcoming, enabling local councils to benchmark their cultural diversity and inclusion policies and practices and assess their progress over time. Awarded and recognized for his contribution to the community, Aleem has spent the last 20 years seeding and mentoring the development of many leading programs, initiatives, and enterprises. He's a master mentor and advisor to various startups and community enterprises and government panels, and a respected presenter on issues related to cultural diversity and social cohesion. As a cultural and social entrepreneur, Aleem loves little more than working with passionate people to implement great ideas that advance the common good. And we are indeed very glad to have you here with us today. Welcome, Aleem. The podium is yours.
Thanks, Kim. It's great to be with you. And thanks, Kate. That was a great presentation and a fascinating project. As Kim mentioned, Welcoming Cities is really relatively new national initiative in Australia, working primarily with local governments and municipalities, partly because we recognise that governments of all tiers of government really are best placed to understand the complexity and the nuances of their communities and work as facilitators in their communities to bring all community stakeholders to the table. One of the challenges that we have, though, in that work is that governments and local governments are no exception to this, are often very risk-averse by nature, and even though our core focus is around supporting local councils and municipalities to kind of leverage the ideas and innovation that come from being welcoming and being inclusive, they're often resistant to innovation. And so, Kate, my first question to you is kind of around that resistance to innovation. In Australia, some governments, particularly state governments, have established policies for translation and interpretation or interpreting services, which essentially mandate the use of accredited translators and interpreters, and even go as far as to advise against the use of machine translation. And the rationale for this is essentially twofold. That there are, as you've noted, and as everyone recognises, there are pitfalls in machine translation, especially in relation to accuracy, and that also in the absence of having a mandated accreditation around translation, or in the absence of having such a policy, their concern is that municipalities and other agencies would potentially reduce their use of skilled translators and interpreters. So I'm wondering, in this context, firstly, what would your advice be to those governments and municipalities? And in your experience, has the project increased or decreased access to and demand for accredited and trained translators?
So no, I do not think that this project or the We Speak Translate project or Google Translate can replace, accredited translators and interpreters. By no means, and we have not seen that here. We still see the need for translators and interpreters, but not every organization, or if you're thinking a grocery store or a library or a bank, is going to have access to translators and interpreters, especially kind of at that moment-to-moment time period. So while I completely say this in my training, Google Translate can give you a good start, but by no means, if you're having really important conversations or really critical conversations, I still say you should use an accredited translator and interpreter. But for a lot of businesses, organizations, institutions that don't have access, don't have funds, and by all means, at that moment when that person's walking through your door and there's an opportunity to connect, I think that an app or a tool of some kind is better than nothing. But no, I still see that I don't think accredited translators and interpreters have to worry at this point. I still think the technology still has a long way to come before we can completely rely on it for those really important conversations that might need to be had, and even still, with the part of the app where you can take a picture and sort of translate a document. I say this is a good starting place, but if accuracy is really key, please make sure you have a translator or a native speaker read this over before you sort of send it out. For quick conversations, for general connections, for your appointment time is at this time, and when there isn't a translator available, I think this is a good option.
Yeah, and I think you make a great point around businesses and contexts where accredited translators wouldn't normally be present in day-to-day conversations and scenarios. And as an external observer, it would seem to me that probably one of the most significant outcomes from your project today relates to that statement that you shared from Ibrahim, the resettled refugee, where he basically said that when he sees the We Speak Translate stickers, he feels confident that people want to speak with him and get to know him. What has been the feedback from businesses and organisations who've engaged with the project in this way? Have they experienced benefits, for example, an increase in business? And have they also then, if they have experienced benefits, kind of built or further services, customer services around this technology?
Okay. This question is slightly difficult for me to answer, only because I think we're still in that sort of growth and expansion phase of the project, and we need to get many stakeholders trained, give them an opportunity to use the technology, use the app. So I definitely see that, a more strategic evaluation of everyone who's participated in the project, that's going to occur. Anecdotal feedback, we have a nonprofit dental center in our city that provides dental care to low-income individuals. And one of the women there had done the training, and I had spoken with her, and she said, we had a Romanian woman come in, and she said, we would have never been able to communicate with her had we not done the training and used the Google Translate app during her appointment. So I think it is opening doors for organizations, and people to meet the needs of new immigrants. Whether organizations and businesses appreciate it or not, I think this is a real simple sort of corporate social responsibility initiative on their part. I mean, it's not good enough anymore. We need a triple bottom line, and I think, this is one thing that businesses can say, look, we've done this training, we want to engage, and we're taking steps to make sure that we can engage and serve and welcome newcomers and new immigrants. Whether or not, businesses, and, I try to communicate that, but whether or not, that's truly understood yet is yet to be seen. But my hope is that, again, as we continue to expand the scope and give people a chance to sort of use it, that there will be a formal evaluation done, and when you bring me back to present again, I'll be able to provide that feedback and sort of have people seen an increase in business. In terms of building services around technology, I think that many of the organizations, the one thing I would say is, do they get a company device, a company iPad? Are there going to be issues around, using my individual cell phone or my personal cell phone to engage using an app with a newcomer? So I think that that's a piece that organizations, especially the larger institutions, have to think about. I know that, our municipal libraries, they're getting some apps, some iPads specifically for the project. So these are going to be available at their front desk and at their information tables so that, staff aren't having to use their personal smartphones or devices. So that's what I see at this point.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about the We Speak Translate project is that it really puts the onus, as you've noted, back on the receiving community, the host community, to step across the language divide and threshold. And in some ways, it's kind of an obvious thing to do. But what do you think that can teach us about what it means to be a welcoming community? And also, what would be your advice to other communities or entities considering a similar project?
Well, I think I've said this a few times. Is the response of this project is I think it also, we had community members who really wanted a way to engage and a way to support with the integration and resettlement of the 462 refugees that we've recently welcomed to the city. And I think it was really key to find something that the host community could sink their teeth into and play a role in, because there was demand and a need and a want. And we saw that just from the outpouring of people wanting to volunteer, wanting to donate, wanting to support. And so, looking at where is the values, how can your project align with the values of your community to kind of meet and address the challenges that refugees may face in terms of integrating into a community. I think that's what I would say, and I think I'd also say is that you know, the ultimate goal and the ultimate outcome is going to be that newcomers, they're going to learn the language, and we totally encourage newcomers learn the language of the host of the country or the community that they're living in or that they're now going to be living in. But this is just sort of a little assistance as they get there, because we know that learning English or learning another language, it does take time, and so you know, this is a support while that complete integration and settlement occurs, which includes, you know, language acquisition.
Finally, from me, before I hand back to Kim to facilitate a Q&A with the many participants in this webinar, have there been any surprising outcomes from your perspective, either good or problematic, that eventuated from the project?
Like I said, you know, I think I would say that just as someone who sort of is trying to move a project or a symbol or a movement forward, it's going to require a lot of persistence, and regardless of how good your idea may be, or, you know, if you're working with one of the tech giants in the world, it's still going to take that persistence and that developing those relationships with organizations, institutions that are going to champion and move the project forward. So I think that's probably the biggest one, and then, you know, as well, just sort of, you know, realizing that, you know, Google Translate as well has a lot of competing, you know, projects and demands, and that you know, the pilot project, as it is right now, you know, the Intercultural Association, you know, it's ours to sort of move forward and expand as much as we can, and then hopefully taking it back to them, and Google Translate at that point is going to say, well, there's definitely interest from you know, not just our city but across Canada, you know, even globally, and there's enough demand saying, you know, we want this sort of project, and we want, you know, apps that support immigrants and that support connections between, you know, between people, so we can build healthy communities. So yeah, I think, and I'm hoping that the most surprising outcomes are yet to come with this project. So yeah, I think that's how I would answer that.
Great, thank you. I'm aware that there's many questions from the listeners, so I'm going to thank you for answering my questions, and I'm going to hand
Thanks,
back to
Aleem.
Kim.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Aleem. Those were great questions, and we've got a great segue really on that last note around you know, looking forward to more surprising outcomes. There's been a lot of interest. We have a lot of questions. A couple of them are very technical, so I'm going to let you answer them super quick. Nilu Mehta wants to know whether the app allows you to use voice recognition.
It does in the sort of the conversation mode. So you can go in and it's the little microphone decal or sort of icon, and when you're in that sort of function in the app, it is actually recording your voice and listening for, you know, whatever two languages you select, and then it will produce a translation that again is played.
And another technical question from Catherine Prophet in New Zealand. She asks, can the Google app help you identify what language is being spoken if you're unfamiliar with it?
Not yet, but
Oh,
very good question. Very
that's
good
great.
question.
Yeah.
I'm sure Google Translate's already on that.
I'm sure they are. That's good. I'm sure it's been written down. Excellent. And we have a couple of specific questions around context for the use of the tool. For example, I have Michael, you would like to know whether you've had any experience using the school in post-secondary institutions to train teaching staff, for example, to help, whether you've done any training with teachers in post-secondary institutions.
Yes, so when we're looking at those bigger systems like school districts, universities, we are getting there, and I'm starting to work with the University of Victoria, our local colleges, and trying to get into the elementary and sort of high schools, because again, there's families, new immigrant families, and how do we connect? So yes, it is coming. It's slow, and like I said, it does take persistence in terms of following up with those leads that I have. But contact has been made, and I think training has happened for individuals at these institutions, and the next step is going to be moving it in sort of on a broader, more sort of institution-wide scale.
Another question, another sector comes from Ruth Lee with Care Center for Internationally Trained Nurses. Her ears obviously perked up when you were talking about the healthcare industry. Great presentation, great tool. She wants to know whether the app has been used in the healthcare sector. And if so, where and what were the feedbacks?
Yes, so
just briefly.
Yep, a lot of public health nurses have been attending the training, and they're really, really pleased with it. Again, they're not always able to have a translator or interpreter on hand, but they are using it with great success. And I organize some sort of just public trainings, and I see a lot of our public health nurses attending those.
Oh, that's great. That's excellent. So now I have a couple of questions about evaluation, at least two. The first one is from Jennifer Johnson in Windsor-Essex County Health Unit here in Ontario. She notes this is a very exciting, innovative project. You briefly mentioned evaluation. Is there an evaluation plan developed? And can you tell us very briefly about the strategies planned to evaluate the tool?
Yes, so I'm tracking all the participants, organizations, and individual participants who have undertaken the training. And so we're going to give them a period of time, and I would say it will probably be mid to late fall that we will get back in touch with them. It'll most likely be an online survey that sort of asks, when did you receive the training? How often, did you put the tool into practice? Again, questions around, did you see an increase in, new immigrants and refugees accessing your services because you were participating in the project, and also some anecdotal evidence as well, and a little bit in terms of the technical. How did you find the translations? And so that will be happening this fall. But again, we need to give people a chance to have the project within their organization for a period of time before I think we can sort of get some meaty data.
That's so interesting. Now I have another kind of very technical call about a specific client community. I have a question here from Anuradha Ramkumar, who says she tried translating some of their intake forms in a pilot project to find languages for those rare clients who come in who do not have any language support. she says she realized that if they're not literate in their own language, then an audio component has to be added to the question. Otherwise, they're not able to read the form. And she asks, do you have any thoughts? Can the Google Translate tool address that issue?
Yeah, and so that's why you know, the conversation mode or the talk to translate is so key. And I mentioned in the presentation that I think that's probably the most important and most used function in the app, but I think it's also the one that's probably the most finicky. And so I've seen that as well, that we have to rely a lot on that component because you know, some newcomers don't have the literacy. The other thing you can do, though, if you are using the text to translate, or even the camera to translate, if you always, and this is a bit technical, but if you always press the little blue arrow button to sort of complete your translation, it's going to bring up a box that holds your translation. And in that box, there should be a little speaker. So if it was a question, it could always be, and you happen to text it in or type it in, that can always be said aloud. So that's another thing to keep in mind, that, and I would say as well, let's say it was a form, you can actually save the specific translations that perhaps you're going to use all the time. So you could perhaps go through and save all the questions and all the translations, and then take people through through the questionnaire that way as well. So it's not impossible. It's not impossible, but and there is some good features in terms of voice recognition, and also having questions asked and translated and asked through the speaker function.
Okay, that's great. So moving now from the technical, a lot of questions are coming in. People are obviously seeing the value and the possibilities here, so they're wanting to take it beyond the pilot. Simon Kulemans says he can see how Google Translate can help break communication barriers for questions or talk about less heavy topics or small talk. He asks, have you been thinking about developing guidelines for users to determine if or when using the app is appropriate in certain situations or for certain topics, instead of using an interpreter? Are you developing guidelines for the appropriate use? Like, what are the limits, I guess, of the tool as part of that question?
You know, that's a great question. You know, I would often say, and I have said, you know, if I was in a medical situation, I wouldn't suggest using the app. But then I've spoken to doctors who said, oh, they thought the app was great in medical situations. So, you know, myself, I haven't thought about creating guidelines for users. I think that's something that, you know, depending on your field, your organization, your business, the service you're delivering, I think that's something that is going to be, you know, kind of individually decided. But again, I always sort of just stress to people that if it's a conversation where accuracy is vital, then you should always go with a translator, an accredited translator and interpreter.
And here's another question, this time around cultural competencies. Again, this has to do with context, I guess. Cities of Migration has this, I guess, from our social media. It says, we know that translation technology like the Google app can facilitate the first step in reducing communication barriers. However, cultural barriers can also create forms of exclusion. So do you have any plans to build programming that can promote intercultural dialogue and sort of cultural competency training into the We Speak Translate project?
Well, I feel like every time training is undertaken, we are providing some insight into, the experience of new immigrants, the importance of integration and what it means to be a welcoming community. So I feel like there is an awareness building with every training that we do, and obviously, there's conversations that happen as part of that training. So, but again, I also feel one of the successes of this training is that it's short, quick. It doesn't take a lot of time, and I think that's really key for a lot of the people who are taking the training. I don't want it being an hour and a half training to be a barrier for organizations participating. I can go in for a lunch and learn, and a training is done. A staff meeting, I can take up 40 minutes of a staff meeting. They still have time for their regular staff meeting. So within our organization, we do a lot of diversity training. I know that, again, working with our public health nurses, I created a workshop on, cultural humility in terms of working with our Syrian refugee population. So I think the short answer is there are components of that in the We Speak Translate training, but I'm also mindful of a lot of times that the time that organizations have, and so I do try to put that in there. But with the understanding that this project and this challenge that they may face, we're competing against a multitude of other challenges and demands that organizations and institutions and businesses are facing. So just the opportunity to get our foot in the door, to have them start thinking and building awareness, I think is key.
That's great. We're getting some fascinating comments from Sue Ellison in Melbourne. Says, wouldn't this be great for a study environment? Guest Ruth Lee. Again, another question about its application in healthcare, hospitals, and community care centers. Saniad from the Immigrant Services Calgary can imagine the app being used in legal aid sessions. So this is, you're getting some great input here. I do have a couple of questions, though, that come up every time we address a technology topic. And so from Lebo, we have the question, do we need to give personal information during downloading and installing? So the issue of privacy, of course, when dealing especially with refugee populations, is sometimes really a critical issue. So perhaps you can take Lebo's question on.
Sure. So So even though the app is free to download, you do require to have initiated either your app, your Google Play Store, the Play Store, or your App Store. So let's say you're using a mobile device, to be able to download any app, whether there's a charge or whether it's free. From my understanding, you do need to have an account, and sometimes that means having a credit card. Now, that is something that we're facing at my work, because we have some staff who they would like to use their work phones. And so, the work phone at present doesn't have, an Apple ID or a credit card connected to it. So that is a piece that I think, it is a piece with downloading any app. A lot of us do it without even thinking, but for those individuals who are very concerned about privacy, and anything downloading any app, then I think that will be a barrier. But I will also say that within the app, in the settings, and I do talk about this with anyone who might be doing any confidential translations, there is an area where you can go in and delete your translation history, and that's something I always show in my trainings, so that if you are having a conversation using your device, and you don't, when you open your device again and you're using Google Translate and you don't want someone to have that confidential information, you can always download your translation history. So I hope that answered that question to some extent.
Very good. Thank you. And then another question that we always get around funding and the cost of the initiative. Level Gomez asks, was this a no-cost initiative? Did any governments provide support for the initiative, or what can you tell us about some of the development costs?
Sure. So as I said, my position it was a contract position, and it was funded through the United Way of Greater Victoria. And within my position, I was given, probably, some freedom and flexibility to look at, resettlement and integration solutions. So I took this, had this idea, and my supervisor supported me in looking and moving it forward. Google provided some funding for all of the printing of all of the decals. And they paid for all the costs associated with our launch event, and they provided the training deck. But other than that, this has literally been a very low budget. There's no cost for any of the training. The training is all free. The decals are free when they've completed training. So it really is a low-cost initiative on sort of all accounts.
That's great. Well, we just have a couple more questions and comments that I'm going to share with you. Sandra Issens asks whether you've planned for a kind of trainer training for immigrant settlement organizations outside of British Columbia that may want to help spread the We Speak Translate to other provinces.
Yeah, and that for me was sort of, after the launch event, I very quickly contacted Google and said, okay, what are we doing next? And how are we going to scale this up, and how are we going to get it out to the whole world? Because without sort of making the training deck available and the decals available, its home is in Greater Victoria right now. So again, my hope is that I think that's a conversation that Google Translate will need to be involved in, and my hope is that there will be great success in the next sort of 6 months with this project, and very shortly we'll be having a conversation with Google Translate saying, okay, how are we going to scale this up? What is a model that we can implement to make this more accessible? And maybe it's the training is housed on within Google, and the training is accessible around the world, and anyone can get trained. To be continued, I guess, will be the answer to that.
Well, I think ideas spark new, better ideas, more good ideas, and that's certainly what we're seeing in the comments from our Q&A session today. I'll share just a couple of those with you before closing. Charlotte Lynn from Calgary Immigrant Women's Association says, thank you, this is great. She wants to see a centralized online location where she can see where you can document the successes of people who've experienced this. There's a great idea for you. We have another idea from Dan Vanderbilt. He says he'd like to see this tool presented in a suite of tools in various contexts, I guess, so that you can tailor the different applications to the specific context in which they might be useful. And then I've got, of course, Jovi Abelanosa from Hamilton City Council, who says what we all want to say, great presentation, so excited about it. what do we need to do to get into the next webinar workshop. So on that note, I think I'll take an opportunity we'll close the section to thank you, Kate. Thank you, Aleem, for sharing your expertise and insights with us. We've had a tremendous session. We've now concluded our Q&A, and we will be closing the session. But before I go, I'd like to perhaps ask you both one quick final question. One for you, Kate, is what's the next big idea for you? What is the next step in this project?
Again, I'm hoping to kind of expand the option of doing training via webinars, and then using that technology, and then using good old snail mail to get the decals to everybody. But again, just sort of based on demand, coming up with new solutions to how we can continue to get this the project out there. And then again, I think evaluating the project is going to be another big piece. And I think being able to provide evidence-based feedback to Google Translate that this is a valuable project and it's something that they should be looking at on a more broader scale. I think that's going to be a really exciting part of the project as well.
Very good. And to you, Aleem, you're also bringing forward piloting at this wonderful new Australian version of the welcoming standard. What's next on your horizon, and can you see a tool like this fitting into your suite of ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. I can see a tool like that fitting into our ideas. Our big piece at the moment is really around, as you mentioned, developing the Australian standard for welcoming cities. There's numbers of fantastic campaigns and initiatives in Australia around building welcoming communities, campaigns that the Australian Human Rights Commission runs, such as Racism It Stops With Me, and the Refugee Council of Australia has an initiative called Refugee Welcome Zones, by which municipalities can be endorsed. But our process and sort of approach is really around bringing some benchmarking and rigour to that work. So beyond doing great work, how do we know that we're doing great work, and what does success look like, and how do we assess that and benchmark that over time? And so that's kind of our big focus at the moment.
That's great. Well, I think a tool like Google Translate might help you expand your user base, and that'll be good for all of us too. Thank you to both of you. We've had a wonderful session. Our time has run out. These are brilliant ideas and tools to help us build welcoming communities wherever we are. So on behalf of all of our participants today, the city's migration team at the Global Diversity Exchange, I'd like to thank Kate Longpre from Victoria and Aleem Ali from Brisbane, Australia, for a brilliant exchange of ideas. Thank you. And to our audiences in cities of migration everywhere, I hope you can imagine this excellent work being interpreted in your city or adapted by your organization and changing your neighborhood. We'd like to hear your stories and share more good practice, so please stay connected, and let's see you soon.